All right, thank you, Shepard, very much. This was the scene a little more than an hour ago, an explosion that looked like something freakish at the moment, now looking like something that might have been more coordinated. Two relatively back-to-back explosions that have already claimed at least a couple of dozen injuries and at least 3 dead. Again, 2 explosions today at the Boston Marathon. Almost as soon as word of this came out, stocks, which is my normal purview, started tumbling. The Dow on the day off better than 265 points on fears. Fears, I should stress, that this is a terrorist attack. There is simply no way of knowing. But I should also point out that as soon as this happened, anyone with money was parking it in bonds. It gets a little arcane. Suffice it to say, that's the money, folks. For average folks in Boston, they are in near lockdown conditions. Tough to leave the city of Boston, tough to get into the city of Boston. Very analogous to other cities that have seen attacks of this ilk, including, of course, famously in New York. But don't forget Madrid and London, and for a while in Atlanta, that city's Olympics many years back. Bill Daley joins me right now, a former FBI investigator who's getting this about the same time we're getting all of this. What do you make of this, Bill, and at least the timing of these explosions right near the end of the race?
Well, Neil, obviously in these type of cases, it's always difficult. You don't want to start speculating. However, just the timing of where these things took place in a crowded area, we'd almost in a way like to feel as though it was some other type of accident that caused these explosions. However, it seems to be 2 of them. They seem to have gone off in quite a near proximity to each other, time and distance-wise, at a place where people are gathered and congregated. So if you err on the side of saying this is an intentional event, it was to harm as many people as could be harmed. And you mentioned briefly there the Olympic Park bombing down in Atlanta, where Eric Rudolph was eventually caught for that bombing, and that was something where a package was left in a backpack in a crowded area where a concert was taking place. So we don't know yet, Neil, what's involved in this, but I would tell you police are actively looking, as I said, in every trash can and every nook and cranny. They're probably trying to get people out of that immediate area and disperse the crowd so we don't have so many people gathered in one area who could then be perhaps even further victims of this. But it's one of these things that police are going to be going and probably hearing from all types of complaints or calls from around the city. We heard one where perhaps there's even a controlled explosion not too far away. It doesn't mean that that's a device. It just means that there's something suspicious.
And what does that mean when they want to follow through on that?
Sure. What it means is that when police get calls for suspicious devices and when they start to investigate, and if they believe that there's some suspicion around that device, where it may be a explosive device, they will detonate it themselves. They will control that detonation for fear that taking that device elsewhere may cause it to explode when people get hurt, or they can't get to it, perhaps do further investigation, or perhaps they have looked at it and feel as though it is a device. But many times we'll see around our major cities is these robots will go in and do an examination of a device, and then they'll make it determine whether or not it's suspicious enough. They may decide just to explode it there on the scene and or take it away. So we may see some of these happening in and around the city as police are hard pressed up in Boston to probably respond to the number of calls they have about suspicious packages.
All right, we're getting word that the president has been alerted to this, and he's offering whatever help federal resources can be made available to Boston officials to help them deal with this. But with Bill Daley right now, the former FBI investigator, when you talk about a series of explosions, Bill, I am remembering London, I am remembering Madrid, and I believe in the case of Madrid, there was sort of like a sucker punch explosion at a subway and then follow-up explosions. In other words, once help was on the way to disarm people all the more. You know, God forbid something like that happen again, but does this lend itself to that type of theme to you? What do you think?
Well, as you mentioned, a theme, and that's one of the concerns that first responders always have, is that when they're responding in to help the people, is there something that then goes after that blows up and affects them? Is it something where people have that well thought out and coordinated, where they want to bring some people into the area, more people, first responders and others, and have an additional device go off? We don't know yet, Neil, if that's the case. I would say is that Boston, like almost every other major city and even minor city in the U.S., has a joint terrorism task force who will both be investigating.
But they presumably would have had their guard up, certainly for a day like this, right?
You're exactly right, and they would have had the guard up. So you would have thought that between intelligence gathering between good police work on the ground, between observations by the officials who are coordinating this event, is they would have had their eyes open. But when you're dealing with large numbers of people with various packages that are left down, whether it's running garments or people with bringing backpacks to in this case the marathon or to a parade or some other major event, it's very, very difficult to police all of that unless you pick up on some intelligence beforehand.
All right, you're looking at one of the explosions. I believe this is the first one that happened around 2:55 p.m. Eastern time. This is about an hour and 10 minutes ago, and as Shepard pointed out a little earlier on the last broadcast, hard to say whether that came from underground or the building, I believe a hotel itself at the time. It's the garbage can thing that brings back to London, and the fact that London, of course, virtually outlaws garbages right now in the city in light of frequent IRA attacks on that city. So garbages are few and far between, if ever, to be found in London these days. They might have lightened up on that somewhat, but we're getting new numbers right now that put the number of injured at 22 and 2 dead, not 3 dead. But again, these are very hard to sort of discern right now, and they frequently will and do change. Pat Brosman joins me now as well. He's a former NYPD detective. And Pat, as you probably heard, a number of cities, including New York, are also sort of beefing up their own security efforts in light of this. What do they look for? What do other cities, so far unaffected, look for in moments like this?
Well, Neil, there's a series of predetermined and pre-existing tripwires that, for instance, in New York and also to a lesser extent in the other major cities that come into play immediately and simultaneously once an event like this unfolds anywhere in the United States. And some of them include, for instance, the fastening of manhole covers, heightened security of bridges and tunnels, all the rudimentary and standard stuff that you would, that would common sense would dictate to take into place in the light of this unfolding nightmare, which is still not clear of the catalyst behind it. And Commissioner Kelly has done a fantastic job, obviously, in the fact that those tripwires have prevented upwards of 20 confirmed and validated attempts on us in recent years. So you can bet your life that those are in place as we speak. They're tightening the noose. The ring of steel is tightening.
Pat, as you and Bill Daley have told me many, many times, we have to be right in warding off against attacks like this 100% of the time. A terrorist or would-be terrorist or someone who has foul intent has only got to be right once, and that makes all the difference. But I am looking at the timing of this, Pat, coming as it did after the big finishers have already wrapped up the race. In other words, I'm not calling the folks who were following up the also-rans, but they weren't the winners. They weren't in the top of the head of the pack. So that's when you would see the most media attention, when those guys, when those women were finishing the race. So it was not when you'd have the media presumably at the height of attention. Are we to glean anything from just that?
Well, good point, Neil. And what it does is, and it's difficult for me to do it, but it accords that there's an intellect and reason and semi-logical planning on behalf of the madmen who, the architects of this nightmarish event. But you have to give a little bit of that out. So the fact is, yes, there is less bang for the buck to the extent that it's not the most vainglorious of all the events in terms of timing. But timing is a subjective call. It shifts and changes on time. Very difficult to nail down. And I think what Bill brought up regarding the intel, the absence of intel, and what you mentioned, the fact that we have to, be right all the time, that logistical horror of the whole idea that we have to be right every single time, and someone gets a homemade bomb into a garbage can and they win the day. For them to pull that off, and then to pull it off within split-second timing, and to dovetail that with certain entrants crossing the line is extraordinarily complex to the extent that every single star has to be in alignment, and I guess it just really disturbs me to give that credit. But history has certainly confirmed that they pulled it off in the past in a terrorist act, and and no one here is discounting that this may very well be terrorism-driven.
Right. There's simply no way to know. Just to update you, for those who just tuned in, there have been the explosion of 2 bombs in Boston today at the Boston Marathon, and near the end of that race, or ostensibly near the end of that race, all the major runners had long since finished and the winners announced. But since more than 24,000 participated in this race, I'm not calling them the stragglers, but they were not the sort of the cream of the running crop. So most of the premier finishers had been done, finished the race, and this occurred after that. The one explosion was one thing. When there were 2 explosions and talk that there might be still more explosive devices in and around Boston, it does get back to this notion that this might have been a coordinated terrorist attack. There's simply no way to know for sure. What we do know for sure at this hour is that 22 have been injured and 2 are dead. But this is a very quickly changing development. From Boston right now, we have Molly Line. I know, Molly, we're expecting a briefing from the Boston Fire Department officials in the next 20 minutes or so. What can you tell us right now?
You know, Neil, when you talk a little bit about the timing of this event, and as you mentioned, the elite runners had finished their race, but this was a holiday in Boston, and this was a time of day when a lot of the runners that just were out to run a marathon because they enjoy running a marathon, the Boston Marathon, would have been hugging their families at the finish line. A very busy time of day when, all of the bars are open, the baseball games are beginning to get out at this time of day. So this was a time of day when the area was literally packed with American civilians, people from all over the world come to run the Boston Marathon. So this was a time when the big elite runners and the race part of the race was done, but the rest of the runners were still coming across the finish line at a very busy time of day down there. We're getting reports that right now that at least 23 people have been injured. We know that many of the injuries are revealed to be catastrophic injuries, the loss of limbs, that there was a lot of blood on the scene, that this is a very chaotic scene still. And as people are being pushed further and further back, some of the local media reporters have been forced to break down and get out of that area and pull further and further back as the police push that scene further and further out to secure it. And there have been reports of other explosions, smaller explosions. So the possibility that the police are setting off other devices that have been found there in the area for safety's sake. So this may be an event that is still unfolding as we're watching, as authorities are still trying to piece that together. Witnesses are saying they're continuing to hear noise down in that area as the area begins to push further and further out, as police begin to secure that scene. Something else to keep in mind, it's a difficult travel day in Boston, in the Boston area on Marathon Monday. A lot of the roads are shut down. It can be tough to get from place to place. As I mentioned, the big sports events are happening. So it's just tough to get around in general. So that could also be adding some challenges here for the police and for the fire department as they're responding. Neil?
Molly, thank you very much. We're getting other reports coming in from Boston Fire Department officials who will be updating everybody in the next 15, 20 minutes or so that the first explosion, presumably the one at the Westin Hotel, might have been emanating from a third-floor meeting room. Again, not underground or not from a trash can. The follow-up explosion might have been, but the first one, the one that is where everything sort of lights up, that was presumably from the Westin Hotel and the third-floor meeting room there. There's simply no way to confirm any of this, so I apologize in advance of getting official word, but I thought I'd pass around what are some, at least, suspicions on the part of authorities at the scene, including in this case